As we continue to look at the Bible through the lens of archaeology, we last saw the evidence for Jeroboam, Elisha, Hezekiah, and Jeremiah, and now we will see the evidence for Daniel and Nehemiah. Our first site is 20 miles south of Baghdad, Iraq, which is the site of ancient Babylon. In Daniel chapter 5, we read that the king of Babylon had a sin-filled feast while using the holy cups from the temple of God. During this abomination of a feast, a hand appeared and wrote on the wall. Daniel was called to interpret the writing, and when he did, he told King Belshazzar that he was about to have his kingdom taken away from him that very night by the Medes and the Persians. Before the king was killed, one of his last actions was to make Daniel the third highest ruler in all of Babylon. King Belshazzar was not recorded in any other historical writings, and records actually indicated that there was a different king named Nabonidus on the throne at the time Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians. This made most scholars mock the book of Daniel as inaccurate and misguided until recently. In 1853, a cylinder was discovered called the Nabonidus cylinder. The cylinder recorded a prayer by King Nabonidus for his son and co-regent Belshazzar. Daniel recorded a piece of Babylonian history that only someone in Babylon at that time could have possibly known. Also, since Nabonidus was king and Belshazzar was co-regent, that is why Daniel was made the third highest ruler in Babylon. The Bible once again perfectly fits the historical facts and is totally confirmed by archaeology. In this video clip, we will see Dr. Walt Kaiser explain some of the background of this discovery.
The book of Daniel records that when Babylon fell, Daniel 5, there was a great feast that took place that night. And in the niche behind the wall, which wall is now being restored, by the way, by our most recent man who claims himself to be Nebuchadnezzar II, he is restoring and trying to make a whole sort of Babylonian Disneyland. Seriously. And in the niche behind the very wall where that banquet took place, where he had a meanie, take a look for some, our weighed in the balances and found wanting. That man is said to be, his name is said to be Belshazzar. But the last king of Babylon who is on the throne was Nabonidus. Problem. How could the Bible say Belshazzar when the official list had Nabonidus, Nabonidus, Nabonidus? And what's this Belshazzar? By the way, not to be confused with Daniel's other name, Belteshazzar, which was his Babylonian name. Well, here we come with some tablets again. Yale, which is not a conservative place particularly, published here, Doherty, published an enormous set of documents out of Saudi Arabia, ancient Arabia, and what do we find but down at Tima, here's Nabonidus for 10 years because he's ill, he can't govern, and he has appointed, yes, you guessed it, Belshazzar to be co-regent. The Bible was on again. If someone had invented that or projected that from later time, they would have missed it. They would have gotten it balled up because it was lost, just like it was lost to us. But again, the Bible stuck its neck out and it was on the money. It was on the money. It was right and it was correct.
Daniel recorded the fall of Babylon, which occurred in 539 BC. Daniel also recorded that after the Medes and Persians took Babylon, Cyrus the Persian ruled the empire and Darius ruled over Babylon. We know from Ezra and Daniel that Cyrus decreed that all the Babylonian prisoners could return to their homes, and the Jews were then allowed to rebuild their cities. In our next clip, we will see the archaeological evidence for this decree of Cyrus, recorded by Ezra and Daniel.
One of the great things about the objects we make is that they live longer than we do, so they can have many different lives. In every one of their lives, in every different generation, they can acquire different meanings, so their meaning can become richer as time goes on. One of the most extraordinary objects in that regard is the so-called Cyrus cylinder. It's about 2,500 years old. It's a small barrel-shaped piece of clay covered with cuneiform inscriptions. Discovered in 1879 by a British Museum expedition to Babylon, now in modern Iraq. But to understand the Cyrus cylinder, we need to start with the world from which it came, a world in which Iran, Persia, reigned supreme.
Our story begins 550 years before Christ, with Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. After uniting the Persian and Median tribes, Cyrus came into conflict with King Croesus of Lydia in what's now modern-day Turkey. He defeated Croesus in battle. Cyrus then clashed with the powerful Babylonian Empire to the west. In 539 BC, he besieged their capital, Babylon. It fell with barely a fight. Persia under Cyrus became a superpower of the ancient world. Cyrus's conquest of Babylon had been predicted and was described in the Old Testament by the Jewish prophet Daniel. That very night, the Babylonian regent Belshazzar had held a feast.
He feasted using the sacred gold vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. And then suddenly, miraculously, there was a hand writing on the wall, and the writing said, "You have been weighed in the balance, you've been found wanting, and your kingdom will be given to the Medes and the Persians." So from this we have the expression, the writing is on the wall, and we have Rembrandt's great painting, Belshazzar's Feast.
Within hours, the great empire of Babylon was no more. Cyrus justified his invasion to the Babylonian people in a proclamation written on clay tablets such as this one, which are likely to have been widely distributed. Surviving fragments, along with the Cyrus cylinder, carry identical wording.
Because the Cyrus cylinder was meant for a Babylonian audience, it was written in the Babylonian language, which is a Semitic tongue related to the modern languages of Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic. The writing system which Cyrus's officials used was the traditional cuneiform script, which had been invented in ancient Iraq well before 3000 BC. It is written by pressing a stylus, something a bit like a chopstick, into the surface of the clay which is nearly dry, and the signs which convey the sound of the language consist of different arrangements of these strokes. They're written one by one, and the reader has to join them up, and the sound emerges from the clay. This is the line that says, "I am Kurash, Shar Kishshati, king of the world, the great king, king of Babylon," and so it goes on. So we're going to write Kurash. So the first sign, Ku, has a big vertical, two small horizontals, one bigger horizontal, a little vertical, and another horizontal, like a box. This is Ku. Then Ra, we have three strong horizontals to begin, one big one next to it, and then one little vertical wedge, and one bigger vertical wedge. Ku, Ra. Now we do Ash, which is three long horizontals, Komsa, and then a vertical in the middle. So we can read this, Ku, Ra, Ash, the name of Cyrus.
The early lines on the cylinder extol Cyrus's virtues and his reasons for invading Babylon. But it's lines 30 to 35 that set Cyrus up as a great leader in the modern liberal sense.
One of Cyrus's first acts after his conquest was to release those who'd been made captive by the Babylonians. This was a mark of his style of rule, and it's this very event that's recorded on the cylinder. So this was a key moment in the history of the Jewish people. They'd spent many years weeping by the rivers of Babylon, And now finally they were allowed to return to Jerusalem and then to rebuild the temple.
Daniel lived until 530 BC. Now we will move back to ancient Jerusalem. Nehemiah recorded how King Artaxerxes allowed him to return and rebuild Jerusalem. And in chapter 2, we read that they began by rebuilding the wall. In this clip, we will review evidence related to Nehemiah and this event. Biola magazine in the spring of 2008 has an article written by Adam Pivick entitled Nehemiah's Wall Discovered. You might not think that something as colossal and well known as Nehemiah's Wall would be hard to find, but this 15-foot thick stone wall eluded archaeologists for centuries, causing some scholars to suggest that it never existed. But on November 8, 2007, at a conference held at Bar Ilan University in Israel, Hebrew University archaeologist Elat Mazar announced the discovery of a 30-meter section of the wall made famous by the biblical account of Nehemiah. The wall was unearthed in February 2007 in the ancient city of David, just south of the old city of Jerusalem. During a dig jointly sponsored by the Shalom Center, a Jerusalem Research Institute, and the City of David Foundation, a non-profit organization for the preservation of the biblical city of David, it was found during an excavation of what Mazar believes to be King David's palace. What led to the recent identification of the wall was the structural decay of a stone tower on the northern end of the excavation site. The tower, previously believed to have been built in 142 to 137 BC during the Hasmonean dynasty, was on the brink of collapse. Members of Mazar's team made emergency attempts to prop it up. In doing so, they began an unplanned dig that led to a treasure trove of artifacts hidden underneath the tower. The artifacts, including arrowheads, pottery, seals, and even the bones of 2 large dogs, were dated no later than the Persian period, 6th or 5th century BC. This led to the revised dating of the tower and the wall to the Persian period, the time specified in the Bible for the construction of Nehemiah's wall. Not all scholars agree with the implications of Mazar's finding. Israel Finkelstein, a professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University, argues that since the artifacts were not connected to a floor or other structural part of the wall, then the wall could have been built later. Yet, Richard Rigsby, professor of Old Testament and Semitics at Biola Talbot School of Theology, rallied to Mazar's cause, saying, Finkelstein is overstating his case. The language he is using is more the language of debate than of scholarship. Rigsby attributed Finkelstein's skepticism to a friendly competition between the archaeologists at Tel Aviv's university and those at the Hebrew University. They're both trying to win the Super Bowl of Israeli archaeology, he said. So Finkelstein doesn't want to concede Mazar's discovery, according to Rigsby. But after seeing the wall firsthand, Rigsby is convinced it's Nehemiah's wall. He, along with 47 Talbot students and their family members, visited the site in January during their stay in Jerusalem on Talbot Bible Land's program tour. Though Mazar was not present, the other archaeologists invited the group to see the excavation. After viewing the location where the artifacts were found, Rigsby said that they certainly go with the wall even though they're not attached to the floor. The floor where the artifacts were found intersects the wall. It appears to be genuinely Nehemiah, he said. According to the biblical account, Nehemiah, a Jewish cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes, wanted to rebuild the broken wall surrounding Jerusalem after hearing of the plight of the Jews who had gone back there after Babylonian exile. Nehemiah successfully petitioned the king to allow him to take a leave of absence from his court duties to help them. despite opposition from the surrounding peoples, he consolidated the disheartened Jewish people into a unified and inspired working force. By God's hand, they did the unthinkable. They repaired the wall swiftly in a mere 52 days. Thomas Finley, chair of Old Testament and Semitic department at Talbot, said that for Christians who already believe the reliability of the Bible, the discovery is not earth-shattering, but it shows that we have even more of a historical document in the Bible. Yet he admits that he's personally delighted in the find. That we have a piece of the wall is kind of exciting, Finley said. Nehemiah completed the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem in 444 BC. He lived until 403 BC. So we have seen that from Abraham to Nehemiah, the Bible's history is confirmed by archaeology. We went from Ur to Haran to Sodom and Gomorrah. Then we saw a palace and a tomb that's been attributed to Joseph in Egypt. We also saw evidence of the Red Sea crossing and some promising information about a Mount Sinai candidate. We also saw the altar on Mount Ebal and the ruins of Jericho confirming Joshua. We visited the very first capital of Israel in Shiloh and the later capital in Jerusalem, and we saw evidence for person after person from the Bible. Amazingly, there are still some finds that we should look at before we close our time in Old Testament archaeology. Let's explore some of the many inscriptions found throughout the Middle East that have also attested to various other Old Testament personalities. In 1896, a stone inscription was found that attested to the existence of Israel. It records the military conquest of Egypt against the Libyans and briefly mentions the name of Israel. This video will review some of the importance of this discovery.
This stela is what the Egyptians would have called a triumph stela, a victory stela, commemorating victory over foreign peoples.
Most of the hieroglyphic inscription celebrates Merneptah's triumph over Libya, his enemy to the west. But almost as an afterthought, he mentions his conquest of people to the east in just 2 lines.
The text reads, Ashkelon has been brought captive, Gezer has been taken captive, Yanoam in the North Jordan Valley has been seized, Israel has been shorn, its seed no longer exists.
History proves the pharaoh's confident boast to be wrong. Rather than marking their annihilation, Merneptah's stela announces the entrance onto the world stage of a people named Israel.
This is priceless evidence for the presence of an ethnical group called Israel in the central highlands of southern Canaan.
The well-established Egyptian chronology gives the date as 1208 BC. Merneptah's stela is powerful evidence that a people called the Israelites are living in Canaan, what today includes Israel and Palestine, over 3,000 years ago.
In the book of Numbers, we read about a prophet for hire named Balaam the son of Beor. The Bible records him saying that he was one who heard and saw visions of the Almighty. In 1967, a Dutch exposition found a 2,800-year-old inscription in Jordan that begins with the words, "The sayings of Balaam, son of Beor, the man who was a seer of the gods." In 1 Kings, we read that Ahab fought against the Syrian king and defeated him in battle. The Kerr monolith records Ahab of Israel fought against Shalmaneser III of Syria, just as the Bible records. In 1 Kings, we read that Omri, who had conquered Moab, died, and Ahab took his place as king of Israel. Later, when Ahab died, 2 Kings records that Moab revolted. A monument known as the Moabite Stone was found in 1868 by looters, and it records the revolt of Mesha, king of Moab, against Israel. This commemorative stone mentions Omri, king of Israel, by name. This video will review the Moabite stone and its confirmation of the biblical account.
In 1868, a tribe of Bedouins inhabiting Dibon, near the ruins of ancient Moab, discovered a slab of stone with an unusual Semitic inscription. The translation of this inscription would change forever the way in which we perceive the ancient Book of Kings. In order to better understand the significance of this find, we must travel over 2,800 years into the past, to a time when Jehoram, the son of Ahab and grandson of Omri, was the king of Israel. The language of Moab is quite similar to Hebrew, in that it is read from right to left and consists not of words as we know them, but of abbreviations, often using 3 or 4 letters, from which we can derive words and names which are also common to the Bible. So it is that we find the name Omri, the king of Israel who originally subjected Moab. We also see his title, Melech Israel, King of Israel, which proves the existence of a state of Israel well over 840 years before Christ. But even more interesting, we find the 4 letters that indicate the name of the God of Israel, a name which means simply, I am. The inscription of the Moabite stone is quite simple to understand once we learn the pronunciation and meaning of some basic letters. We find the letters Aleph, Nun, Kaf, which are pronounced Anoki, and also mean I am. Then the letters Mem, Shin, Ayin, Mesha, Bet, Nun, pronounced Ben. This word means son or descendant in both Hebrew and Moabite. Kaf, Mem, Shin, Chemosh, name of one of the gods of Moab. Mem, Lamed, Kaf, Melech, king. Mem, Aleph, Bet, Moab. In the second book of Kings, we find a brief description of King Mesha. Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder who had to deliver to the king of Israel the tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against Israel. So King Jehoram marched out of Samaria and mustered all Israel to battle. Then Jehoram sent word to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, saying, "The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to battle against Moab?" With regard to this same battle, Mesha tells us, "Omri, king of Israel, afflicted Moab for many days, because Chemosh was angered against Moab. And his descendant has also said, I will afflict Moab. He said it in my lifetime, but I have seen his defeat, and Israel has perished forever." Now the men of Gad had inhabited the city of Gadaroth in Moab since the ancient times, for the king of Israel had built Gadaroth. But I besieged the city, and exterminated its inhabitants, as an offering to Chemosh, and to the whole of Moab. A brief glimpse at the Book of Kings in the Bible reveals the rest of the story of this tragic battle. Then Jehoshaphat asked the king of Israel, "By which way shall we march against Moab?" And Jehoram replied, "We shall go by way of the wilderness of Edom." So the king of Israel, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom marched out against Moab. Now when the king of Moab saw that the battle was not going in his favor, he took with him 700 swordsmen, in an attempt to break through to the king of Edom. But when this also failed, he took his son, his firstborn, who was to reign after him, and sacrificed him on the walls as an offering. When the men of Israel saw what the king of Moab had done, they were seized with horror, and each returned to his own home.
In 2 Kings, we learn that Jehu became king over Israel, and he killed all of the house of Ahab until none remained. On a large stone obelisk from the time of these events, King Shalmaneser III recorded that he received a tribute from Jehu, and a carving on that monument even depicts the biblical figure Jehu. In 2 Kings, Hezekiah prayed when Jerusalem had been surrounded by the Assyrian army under Sennacherib, and God heard his prayer. After they had been surrounded and under siege, God sent the angel of the Lord, who slayed 185,000 Assyrians in one night, which caused Sennacherib to go home. This video will review the evidence of this relationship between Sennacherib and Hezekiah.
Sennacherib was the king of Assyria and the son of Sargon II. Austin Henry Layard discovered his palace in 1847 in the city of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. Inscribed in cuneiform on the colossal sculptures in the doorway of his throne room was Sennacherib's own account of his siege of Jerusalem. The Iraq Department of Antiquities has worked to preserve the site and named it as the Sennacherib Palace Site Museum. Wall reliefs from Sennacherib's palace can be viewed online at the British Museum's official website. Sennacherib's prism, also known as Taylor's prism, is a hexagonal baked clay prism containing 6 paragraphs of cuneiform written in the Akkadian language. The prism was discovered in 1830 by Colonel Taylor in the ruins of Sennacherib's palace and was purchased by the British Museum. The text was translated by Daniel David Lukenbill of the University of Chicago Press in 1924. Sennacherib's prism contains the following text: I had completed the palace in the midst of the city of Nineveh for my royal residence. I shut King Hezekiah up like a bird inside Jerusalem. Hezekiah the Judahite. The siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib is documented in 3 books of the Bible, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah. Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib king of Assyria came up against all the defense cities of Judah and took them. Sennacherib's prism also contains the name of Merodach-Baladan, found in the book of Isaiah. In my first campaign I accomplished the defeat of Merodach-Baladan. At that time Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon. The prism gives a detailed account of Sennacherib's war campaigns, and he constantly brags about the many people he has killed and what nations he destroyed and forced to pay tribute to him. He described hanging people on stakes, as well as amputating hands and genitalia of his enemies. The Bible states that God sent angels to destroy his entire army for his arrogant threats against Hezekiah and Israel. Hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he sent to reproach the living God. Isaiah goes on to describe that Sennacherib was killed by his sons. The Chronicles on the reigns from Nabu-Nasir, ABC 1, is one of the historiographical texts about ancient Assyria and Babylonia. Line 35 reads, On the 20th day of the month Tebetu, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, was killed by his son in a rebellion. The historical evidence proves that King Sennacherib's existence and his palace at Nineveh. Sennacherib's own writings and Syrian documents testify that he did in fact lay siege to Jerusalem and was killed by his sons.
In 2 Kings, we read that Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim captive and put his uncle in his place after renaming him Zedekiah. This Babylonian tablet also records the same timing and events as the Bible. The city was besieged, the king taken captive, and a new king appointed in his place.